Coming up on Arirang News, the G7 summit held in Cornwall has wrapped up with a joint statement. In it, the leaders call on North Korea to return to the negotiating table. South Korean President Moon Jae-in, who was a G7 guest, is now in Austria for the second leg of his trip. As South Korea's vaccine campaign rolls on, pop concerts and sports events will now open to much bigger crowds. Travelers from other countries will also be able to enter Korea if they've been fully vaccinated. And South Korea's exports of information and communications technology surged in May to the second highest level on record for that month, led by semiconductors, displays, and phones. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. South Korean President Moon Jae-in and his Japanese counterpart, Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga, had originally planned to hold their very first talks in person in Cornwall, but that never happened. Japan decided unilaterally to call it off, citing Seoul's defense exercises on and around the Dokdo Islets. Our Kim Dami reports.
Japan unilaterally called off the agreed-upon talks between President Moon Jae-in and Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga during the G7 summit, blaming Seoul for the irregular military exercise it's holding this week in defense of the Dokdo Islets. Sources say the two countries had agreed before at the working level to hold a polo-side meeting in Cornwall. Japan's complaint is nothing new. It often claims falsely that Dokdo is Japanese territory and the defense exercises are held twice every year. But it's unusual and considered senseless to cancel a discussion planned between the leaders of the two countries at such a high-profile venue.
Suga seems to be trying to maintain his domestic approval ratings, which have been falling because of his mismanagement of the pandemic, by refusing to get along with South Korea and turning his back on Seoul.
That lines up with what Suga said himself to reporters, that a summit with President Moon is off the table until the issue of Dokdo is, in his words, resolved. Seoul has tried to set up the two leaders' first in-person meeting to settle the long-simmering issues of Japan's system of wartime forced labor and sexual slavery. Rounding up his Cornwall trip in a social media post Sunday, Moon called the brief exchange of greetings with Suga a precious occasion which may serve as a new beginning in terms of South Korea-Japan relations. But he further expressed regret that the encounter with Suga did not lead to talks. Meanwhile, in Cornwall, the G7's joint communique urged North Korea to return to dialogue for the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And welcoming the Biden administration's new North Korea policy, the G7 endorsed Washington's willingness to continue trying to engage with the regime. The leaders also called for all states to fully implement UN Security Council resolutions and sanctions, and said the North should respect human rights and immediately resolve the issue of the Japanese nationals it abducted in the 1970s and 80s. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
President Moon is in Austria now for the second leg of his week-long visit to Europe. He'll be in Vienna until Tuesday for a state visit. Moon is the first Korean leader to visit Austria since the two countries established diplomatic ties in 1892. First up is an official welcoming ceremony on Monday, which will be followed by a summit with Austrian President Alexander van der Bellen. President Moon will also hold talks with Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz and attend a state dinner on the same day. He will also visit Vienna City Hall and meet other local political figures. The G7 communique at the end of the summit expressed a high level of commitment in tackling some of the most challenging issues the world faces today, like COVID-19. Our Kim Ji-yeon takes a closer look at what was discussed at the first face-to-face G7 held in 2 years, and what areas in which the outcomes fell short of expectations.
The joint communique issued by the G7 on Sunday tackles some of the most prominent issues the world faces today, namely the coronavirus pandemic and climate change. The G7 countries pledged to provide more than 1 billion vaccine doses to poor nations in the next 12 months, either by donating their surplus supply directly or by donating to the COVAX scheme. However, the details of vaccine donation volume or timeline by nation were not released. Also, the G7 leader's stance was not clear regarding the temporary waiver of intellectual property rights for vaccines, a move that would promote vaccine access but would hamper innovation in the pharmaceutical sector. But they did vow to participate in discussions at the World Trade Organization. On climate, the communique stated the G7 countries will strive to deliver on their previous commitment to provide $100 billion annually to help low-income nations reduce their carbon emissions. But some activists, including global charity group Oxfam, called on the G7 countries to step up their actions.
We have a once-in-a-century pandemic, absolutely unprecedented. We have 9 years to save the planet. It's really hard to exaggerate the scale of what needs to be done. So if you look at what they've done in the last few days and compare it to that, then you really can't call it anything more than an abject failure.
The G7 countries, meanwhile, sharpened their tone on China in respect to trade and human rights, where Beijing is accused of committing human rights abuses against the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang. The leaders' communique stated the group would consult on collective approaches to challenging non-market policies and practices which undermine the fair and transparent operation of the global economy. The U.S.-led Build Back Better for the World plan was adopted, which promises to offer financing for infrastructure projects in developing countries to promote their transition to a renewable energy, a direct response to China's Belt and Road Initiative. On trade, the countries agreed to commit to a global minimum tax of at least 15% to make it harder for multinational corporations to avoid tax. What stands out for South Korea, India, and Australia this year is the G7's Open Societies Charter, in which these guest countries participate in the drafting and signing of the joint communique rather than just being there to observe. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
In May, South Korea's exports of goods related to information and communications technology were the second largest on record for that month. This was thanks to strong shipments of semiconductors, displays, and phones. Pae-eun-ji has more.
South Korea's ICT exports in May increased for the 12th consecutive month, marking the second largest amount for the month of May on record. According to the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy on Monday, the country shipped $17.73 billion worth of ICT products last month, up 27.4% on year. The increase was mainly led by surging demand for semiconductors, displays, and mobile phones. Exports of semiconductors rose 24%, with the figure surpassing the $10 billion mark for the first time in 2.5 years. Displays exports were up almost 40%, thanks to booming demand for OLED and LCD panels. Shipments of mobile phones jumped 43%, rising for the 7th straight month. Exports of computers and related devices were also up nearly 10%, recording an on-year gain for the 3rd consecutive month. By region, growth was mostly driven by South Korea's top trading partners. Shipments to China, South Korea's largest export destination, jumped nearly 20%. Exports to Vietnam spiked almost 40%, the US more than 30%, and the EU by 34%. South Korea's imports of ICT goods also rose in May, by close to 18% on year. This resulted in a trade surplus of more than $7.2 billion in May. Pae-eun-ji, Arirang News.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Yang Jun-seok, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, good afternoon. Thanks for making time today.
Happy to be here.
Well, last Friday, stocks in New York continued their rally as inflation numbers came out for May at the highest they've been since the financial crisis, 2008. The S&P hitting record highs for 2 sessions in a row. What's the story in the global markets as we start a new week?
Okay, well, somewhat surprisingly, even though the inflation figures were very high, the market shrugged it off. And the reason it seems to be is that while the inflation figure is very high, the factors determining that high inflation seems to be temporary. What we mean by that is that there's a couple of crucial factors which perhaps overblew the inflation figure to 5%. First, if we take the 12-month figure of 5%, you start at last May, and last May was the beginning of the coronavirus recession. So in March and April in 2020, prices actually fell by about 0.9%, and that is blowing up the current inflation figures. And then if we look at the individual categories in the May inflation, we see that the used car by itself was accountable for about a third of the 5% inflation figure. Used cars rose, prices of used cars rose 29.7% over 12 months, but new cars rose only by 3.3%. It seems to be a temporary effect because new cars are not being fully produced right now because of the semiconductor shortages. And the monthly rise in inflation in the United States fell from 0.8% in April to 0.6% in May. And gasoline prices, even though it rose more than 56% over the last 12 months, it fell during April and May if we just look at the monthly figures. In April, it fell by 0.4%, and in May, it fell by 0.8%, seasonably adjusted. And where we see some of the highest increase in prices in the United States were the where prices fell during the coronavirus recession, like hotels and airfares. And finally, core inflation was much lower than the headline inflation figure. It was only 3.8%. So the market seems to be shrugging the inflation figures off, figuring that it is normalizing back to the place where it was before the coronavirus. And they're also waiting for the Fed FOMC meeting next week. So the market seems to be shrugging off the inflation figures, but they may start worrying about tapering. I don't think they'll be worried about rising in interest rate this year, but I think they will be concerned that perhaps tapering will now start fairly soon because the U.S. is making a solid recovery. And even though I just said that inflation was high overall, it is rising over most categories, just not very quickly.
Yeah, the example you give of the used cars is a really great one to show that it may indeed be temporary. And against this backdrop of the spike in inflation, everyone's watching to see, as you said, what the Fed says this month. Here in Korea, not a clear direction really in the markets today. Retail investors were net buyers, though. Tell us about the local markets.
Okay, well, the local market did set a new record today. Kospi rose by 0.09%, not very high, but it was enough to have the highest closing on record, 3252.13. It beats the record of 3252.12 that we saw last week. And during June, it was continuously above 3200. Individuals bought on the net, institutions sold, foreigners sold, but by tiny amount, only 24.6 billion won. Kosdaq, it rose by 0.63%. It ended today at 997.41. It did not quite reach above the 1,000 levels that we saw in April, but it is getting very, very close. Individuals and institutions bought, foreigners sold, and the tech stocks today seems to be mixed. Celltrion rose on the news of progress on their treatment for coronavirus, but Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix remained relatively weak. Their prices fell today.
And away from equities to look at precious metals for a minute. Gold has seen a big rise over the past couple of years, of course, but the price of palladium has risen even more. That's a metal that's talked about a lot less, but some say it could surge even farther ahead of gold. What do you see happening with precious metals?
Okay, well, palladium is, at least before the coronavirus, was not really considered an investment metal, but the price has been increasing very quickly for several years, even before the coronavirus. And the reason is that the palladium is a very rare metal, which is used in some very important components, components which are in more and more demand recently. For example, palladium is used in catalytic converters for cars and electrodes for electronics, and it's also used for producing hydrogen. Now, catalytic converters are crucial if you want to have cleaner gasoline engines. Sales of electronics have been growing because of the coronavirus, and in Korea we've been interested in using more hydrogen power, and palladium is one of the more crucial elements that you need to produce hydrogen. So if, as we believe, things are going to be more environmentally aware in the future, then demand for palladium should continue to rise. And the concern here is that, well, the investors have been looking for the next big thing. When the coronavirus hit, after the initial negative hit we saw on the stocks and bonds, the stocks and bonds rose by a tremendous amount because of the excess liquidity. But once it got to a certain level, people started worrying whether stocks and bonds would go any higher, so they started looking for some other investment assets. A lot of it went to Bitcoin. Some of it started going into minerals, and the concern is that this recent rise of the palladium prices is maybe an offshoot of that. With the excess liquidity not knowing where to go, it might fall here because, well, stocks and bonds and Bitcoins may be reaching their limit.
Indeed. Well, in Korea, with vaccines taking off, the restrictions are slowly being eased. From today, there'll be pop music concerts again, for one thing. That could be an optimistic sign for the economy. But what else is on your radar for the economy this week?
Okay, well, the biggest news is the U.S. Fed FOMC meeting. A lot of people are concerned whether they will be given signals that the tapering will come earlier than expected. At least in my opinion, the signal has already been given. If we look at the minutes of the last meeting, they did mention that perhaps it is time to talk about tapering coming in during this year. And that, at least to me, seems like a clear signal, but the markets do not seem to think so. They're looking for a clearer signal that tapering may begin sometime this year. Now, BOK also has important event this week as well. They're going to announce the May minutes for the May meeting. And again, for BOK, the question is whether they will raise interest rates sometime this year. Other variables of interest is U.S. retail sales and U.S. producers price index, which will show whether U.S. inflation is accelerating and whether U.S. recovery is taking hold.
Well, that should give us a lot to talk about next time, Professor, and we'll have to leave it there for today. Thanks so much for sharing your insights with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
South Korea on Monday reported fewer new cases of COVID-19 than it has in over 2 months. There were 399 new cases, though there are fewer tests done over the weekend, and cases generally rise later in the week. This brings the total number of cases to date to more than 148,000. This was the first day there have been fewer than 400 cases since March 29th. The virus reproduction rate, however, the R0 number, has risen back above 1, meaning it's spreading a little faster. They've been encouraging people to plan their summer holidays outside of next month's peak season. As vaccinations continue, South Korea is easing the rules on concerts and sports events. Concerts can have up to 4,000 people now, and sports events potentially many more than that. And more students are resuming in-person classes. Jang Tae-hyun has the details.
More people in South Korea will be able to enjoy sports events and performances starting from Monday. For K-pop and other music concerts, audiences of up to 4,000 people are allowed for both indoor and outdoor events. Previously, the limit was just 99 people. People will, however, have to keep their masks on and stick to their designated seat, and they're not allowed to eat or shout. Similar changes have also been implemented for sports events. In the capital region, where level 2 distancing measures are being enforced, up to 30% of a venue's capacity will be allowed at events like soccer and baseball. That's 3 times more than the current 10%. And outside the capital area, the capacity limit has gone up from 30% to 50%. Meanwhile, more middle school students in the Seoul area will come back to classrooms as the school capacity limits are increased to 2/3 starting Monday. It had previously been 1/3 of capacity. And vocational schools which have hands-on lessons like auto repair can resume in-person classes. This comes as the Education Ministry is taking a step toward full attendance at all levels, starting from the next semester in August. Jang Tae-hyun, Arirang News.
And good news for those in South Korea who've been separated from their loved ones in other countries because of the pandemic. Starting next month, people who've been fully vaccinated overseas will be able to visit South Korea without having to self-quarantine when they get here. Choi Won-jong has the details.
Starting in July, people who are fully vaccinated overseas will be exempt from 2-week self-quarantine when arriving in the country. The change comes nearly a month after the quarantine exemption was first given to those who received their vaccines in South Korea. Who exactly will be eligible for the exemption from self-quarantine? The health authorities last Sunday said it only applies to travelers who received their COVID shots overseas, but within same country. The policy will apply to Korean citizens or foreigners who come to see their spouses, parents, or children, but doesn't cover those visiting their siblings or more distant family members. Also, those who come for business or public interest reasons are good to go. In the past, only top officials from companies were exempt, but from July, any important business trips will be applicable. What about fully vaccinated parents traveling with unvaccinated children? Unvaccinated kids under the age of 6 are still exempt from mandatory quarantine if both parents are fully vaccinated overseas. However, those unvaccinated children aged over 6 are required to go through mandatory quarantine in South Korea once they arrive. What kind of COVID-19 vaccines will be applicable? Only the 7 COVID-19 vaccines that have received the WHO's emergency approval are listed. These are AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Moderna, Janssen, Sinopharm, Sinovac, and Covishield. However, Sputnik V is not included. Application cannot be made until at least 2 weeks after vaccination. How to apply for the exemption? And travelers are required to submit application including approved vaccination and family relations. Application must be made at least 7 days before departure. Which countries are not included in the quarantine exemption? People traveling from countries with major outbreaks or mutation will not be allowed to skip the quarantine. As of Monday, travelers from South Africa, Brazil, and 11 other countries, mainly in Southern Africa and South America, will still need to quarantine for 2 weeks. All travelers, including those with exemption, will need at least 3 COVID tests, 72 hours before departure, on the day of arrival, and 7 days after arrival. 최원정, 아리랑 뉴스.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.